"26 videos, 7 levels. I've spent hours going through police records and compiled the most disturbing dashcam footage ever captured. Starting with the uncomfortable, we'll gradually uncover footage so disturbing you won't be able to shake it off. So, let's start at the tip of this iceberg. Level 1. Taiwan Road Incident. In 2013, a group of drivers was making their way down a mountain road in Keelung City, Taiwan, unaware of the danger unfolding right above them. At the top of the hillside, days of heavy rain had loosened the soil and rocks had already begun shifting, but the drivers below had no idea. Then, without warning, debris started raining down onto the road ahead. A sedan close by slowed and veered slightly into a small side lane, probably trying to avoid the debris. However, the next moment, the entire hillside gave way. A massive boulder, several times the size of the car, tore loose from the mountain and came crashing down toward the road. It slammed into the asphalt with enough momentum to keep rolling, but by some miracle, it stopped just mere meters away from the sedan. The driver was able to escape without injury, missing death by seconds and meters. Internet users who watched the footage pointed out just how lucky they were, because that split-second decision to slow down and veer into the side lane saved that driver's life. Stuck on a bridge. It was a Tuesday night drive across the Marcelo Fernan Bridge in the Philippines. But halfway across, something felt off. The car seemed to sway on its own, a strange circular motion that didn't match the road. One could easily dismiss this as maybe an uneven pavement. Except it wasn't the car, it was the bridge. Before anyone could react, the entire structure began swinging from side to side, and vehicles ahead slammed their brakes as drivers realized what was happening. Motorcyclists wobbled, barely staying upright, while the dashcam captured lampposts trembling against the night sky. Inside the car, you could hear the fear in the occupants' pleas. One passenger kept praying out loud as the bridge continued to sway beneath them. They had no choice but to keep going, as reversing was impossible with traffic piling up behind. For about 30 seconds, everyone on that stretch of road was trapped, completely at the mercy of whatever was happening below. In reality, what they were experiencing was a 6.9 magnitude earthquake, its epicenter located just off the coast of Cebu province. Approximately 34,000 people were caught in the zone of the most severe shaking, while another 3.36 million across Cebu and Leyte provinces felt strong tremors that night. Buildings collapsed, and churches that had stood for centuries crumbled. And almost immediately after the shaking stopped, it started raining heavily, making rescue operations nearly impossible. By the time authorities could assess the full extent of the disaster, at least 69 people had lost their lives and more than 150 were injured. Eventually, the people on that bridge made it across safely, but for thousands across Cebu that night, the shaking was only the beginning of something far worse. Midnight Drive. It's 2 a.m. on a dimly lit stretch outside Nashville, and a driver is cruising at considerable speeds through the darkness. The road ahead seemed empty until a figure suddenly appeared in the middle of the lane. It was a woman, standing with her arms raised as if she were signaling for help. And before the driver could even process what he was seeing, she stepped over the center line directly into his path. At that speed, braking wasn't an option, so the driver swerved in a split second and missed her by mere inches. It was so close that one wrong move would have meant hitting her. By the time he checked his rearview mirror, she was already swallowed by the darkness. When he uploaded the footage to Reddit, some commenters pointed out that it could have been a carjacking setup. Others said they would have kept driving and called the police immediately. Either way, the driver never found out who she was or why she was standing in the middle of a road at 2 a.m. The parade route. On June 10, 2023, thousands of families gathered along the streets of Portland for the Grand Floral Parade. But what should have been a celebration was interrupted by a driver in a fit of rage. Dashcam footage captured him on a phone call, visibly agitated. At the time, nearly every exit had been blocked off due to the parade. So when he reached an exit ramp blocked by 2 Oregon Department of Transportation trucks, he snapped. Yet instead of turning around, he squeezed past the trucks and forced his way onto the closed route. That decision dropped him directly into the parade street, which was lined with people. Families sat on curbs, children waited for floats, and volunteers stood along the road doing their jobs. The sight of the crowd should have stopped him. Instead, he kept going. As the truck rolled forward, panic rippled through the crowd. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them out of the way as the vehicle approached. Still, he didn't slow down. At this point, a motorcycle officer assigned to the parade spotted what was happening and moved in fast, signaling the driver to stop. But again, the driver refused, and he screamed at the officer to get out of the way. As the chase continued, footage from spectators captured him throwing a gun out of his window. Moments later, he swerved onto a side road and smashed through another barricade, narrowly missing the volunteer stationed there. Eventually, he left the parade route, but even then, he wouldn't stop for the police. The chase continued through city streets until the air support unit took over and began tracking his truck from above. He was finally stopped at a nearby intersection where officers pulled him out of the vehicle and took him into custody. Police later identified the driver as Sidney Meacham, a 43-year-old Portland man. Even worse, his record showed he was a registered sex offender with prior convictions and had faced multiple traffic violations over the years. Ultimately, he pleaded guilty to multiple felony and misdemeanor charges and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But nothing could undo the terror those people must have felt that day. What a stupid thing to go to jail over. Oh, I'm grumpy about a parade being in the way, so I'm going to commit multiple crimes? People are dumb. Level 2. Drive through Oakland. The Oakland Hills were a route she had driven through for 38 years, but on this morning, the road had something different waiting for her. The woman was cruising along when she noticed a white car driving ahead of her. It slowed down, and before she knew it, it stopped completely, blocking the entire lane. Suddenly, 2 men jumped out with guns drawn and started sprinting toward her vehicle. One of them reached her door and tried to yank it open, but it was locked, so he started banging on the window, gun aimed directly at her face, screaming for her to get out. In that moment, she made a split-second decision. She floored the gas, swerved around their car, and sped off. But the men weren't about to let her go that easily. They scrambled back into their vehicle and chased her. Luckily, she managed to lose them and reach safety, where she immediately called the police. Investigators later linked one of the suspects to a string of other carjackings in the East Oakland Hills. Police confirmed an arrest was imminent, but the most important thing was that she got out unharmed. Yeah, I'm sorry, if I see people get out of a car with guns, I'm speeding away as quick as possible. Boxed in. When you're driving on a busy road in broad daylight, the last thing you'd expect is an ambush. But that's exactly what happened to a woman driving through a motorway junction in Johannesburg on May 30th, 2015. She was approaching the M2 on-ramp in Fordsburg around 4 p.m. when the white Volkswagen ahead of her suddenly stopped, blocking her path completely. There was no room to reverse or swerve through. She was boxed in. And before she could process anything, 4 men jumped out of the Volkswagen armed with guns and a hammer. 3 of them rushed toward her vehicle while 1 stayed back to wave off curious motorists. Within seconds, they had her surrounded, weapons pointed, leaving her no option but to comply. Not long after, the video cuts off. No one knows if shots were fired, if there were other passengers in the car, or if the woman was hurt. A former South African policeman shared the video on Facebook, urging people to circulate the suspects' faces so police could track them down. But no information was ever released on whether the suspects were caught. High-speed chase. On the morning of January 31st, 2025, police dashcam footage followed the final moments of a pursuit as officers closed in on a stolen blue Chevy Trailblazer. Less than half an hour earlier, it had been taken from a man sitting in his own driveway. The victim called 911 immediately, and a short while later, officers spotted the stolen vehicle on the road, and the chase began. The cruiser stayed tight behind it through residential streets while officers called out locations over the radio, inching closer with each turn. The driver tried to shake them by cutting through the neighborhood, but the route boxed him in. There wasn't much space to build speed, and there were only so many corners left to take. And that's when it fell apart. The SUV slid off the road and dropped into a ditch. For a split second, it looked like it was over, but the driver burst out and took off on foot. As officers closed the distance, they realized he was carrying a weapon. One of the cruisers surged forward to cut him off, and in the scramble to stop him, the vehicle struck him before he could get away. Officers moved in immediately and took him into custody. Police later identified the suspect as 19-year-old Hubie Marion III. They said he was taken into custody without injuries. The weapon he had on him was later described as a 3D printed pistol, a so-called ghost gun with no serial number, meaning there was no straightforward way to trace it back to a seller or manufacturer. Marion was booked on 10 felony charges, and his bond was set at $500,000 cash. The private bus incident. A motorcycle vlogger was cruising along a highway in India when his helmet camera captured something terrifying unfolding right in front of him. The private bus ahead of him had started drifting toward the median. The driver couldn't correct it in time, so the bus kept veering off course, picking up speed as it approached a bridge over a nearby river. And that's when things went from bad to catastrophic. The bus slammed into the bridge's retaining wall with enough force to break through part of the barrier. But the crash itself wasn't the terrifying part. It turned out the momentum carried the vehicle forward until nearly half of it was hanging mid-air over the water below, with 23 passengers still trapped inside. The only thing keeping the bus from plunging into the river was its undercarriage, which had gotten wedged between the iron girders and the parapet. One shift in weight, and it could have tipped over completely. The vlogger pulled over immediately, and so did other motorists who witnessed the crash. They climbed onto the wreckage and started pulling passengers out themselves before the bus could shift any further. You could see the terror on the passengers' faces as they were pulled from the wreckage. Even the ones who weren't physically injured were shaking, clearly traumatized by how close they'd come to going over. By the time police and rescue teams arrived, all 23 passengers had been evacuated. 13 were injured, but none critically. Aftermath footage showed just how severe the impact really was. The tires had blown off, the metal frame had crumpled inward, and looking at the wreckage, it was hard to believe anyone walked away from it at all. Some viewers pointed out that the road narrows sharply at that section of the bridge without a clear warning. Others suggest the driver may have fallen asleep, which would explain the slow drift before impact. Authorities are still looking into what actually caused the accident, but one thing is clear. If that undercarriage hadn't caught on those iron girders, this would have been a recovery mission and not a rescue. If you thought the footage so far was disturbing, I need to warn you, the dash cams in the next levels capture things far worse. So hit that subscribe button and and let's dive in. Level 3. Speeding through the night. There's a special thrill that comes from speeding through the night with the wind rushing past you. But in May 2021, a motorcyclist in South Australia was about to learn how quickly that thrill can turn into a nightmare. He was weaving in and out of traffic on a busy highway, his helmet-mounted camera capturing every reckless maneuver. The speedometer kept climbing, 120, then 160, eventually pushing past 200 kilometers per hour. At that speed, headlights blur into streaks and reaction time shrinks to almost nothing. So when a stationary truck appeared in his path, he had no chance to brake and nowhere to go. In the next second, the bike slammed into the back of the truck at full speed. The impact was so violent that even watching the footage, you can feel the force of it. He should not have survived it, but the strangers he had been recklessly weaving past just seconds earlier rushed to his side. They called an ambulance and followed instructions over the phone to resuscitate him while waiting for paramedics to arrive. He spent the next 2 months in a coma. When he finally woke up, his life as he knew it was gone. He now has permanent brain damage, can barely communicate, and requires 2 full-time caretakers for the rest of his life. His wife later allowed the South Australian police to release the footage publicly, hoping it might stop someone else from making the same mistake. Following the incident, the Australian government introduced tougher penalties for extreme speeding, including up to 5 years in prison and a minimum 5-year license disqualification. The takedown. For Officer Brandon LeBlanc, it was just another arrest. But for the man on the other side of those cuffs, everything was going to change. LeBlanc was trying to detain the man outside his patrol car. He pushed him onto the hood, attempting to get control, but the man kept struggling, making it hard for LeBlanc to get the cuffs on. That's when LeBlanc switched tactics. He adjusted his grip, lifted the man clean off the ground, and slammed him head first into the concrete from about 6 feet up. The man's body went limp the moment he hit the pavement. He lay there while LeBlanc completed the arrest, and as the footage continued, the man stayed unresponsive. After the arrest, officers transported Williams to a local hospital, but his injuries were so severe that he had to be airlifted out for emergency medical care. The man was later identified as Christopher Williams Jr., and his family revealed that he had sustained a serious head injury. They filed a lawsuit claiming he now suffers from severe permanent physical impairment. Eventually, LeBlanc was placed on paid administrative leave, but he resigned 1 day before the body camera footage was officially released. Once it went public, people were furious. Commenters called it aggravated, and some said it looked like he was trying to kill him. Even so, the state's Office of Special Prosecutions cleared him of any criminal charges, calling LeBlanc a good officer who made a very bad mistake. What about just normal people who make very bad mistakes? Bet you don't go so lenient on them. Wisconsin gas leak. On July 10, 2018, firefighters in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin responded to a gas smell in downtown. As soon as they arrived, they started evacuating people from nearby structures, trying to clear the area before things got worse. But none of them knew that time was running out. About 45 minutes later, the block exploded. A huge blast tore through the area, sending a column of fire and smoke high into the air, throwing debris across the street. People nearby ran on instinct. The shockwave traveled far enough that witnesses said they felt it from about a mile away. The aftermath was devastating. Fires kept burning throughout the night with thick smoke rising into the sky. 5 buildings were badly burned and cars were left mangled beyond recognition. One of those buildings was a bar co-owned by Corey Barr and his wife. Corey was a 34-year-old volunteer fire captain who had served the department for over a decade. So when he heard the gas leak was near his property, he headed down to help. but never came back. Investigators later revealed that the leak began when a private contractor accidentally punctured a natural gas main, and that miscommunication contributed to delays in the response. In the end, no criminal charges were filed, but the contractor was fined $25,000. A statue now stands in Sun Prairie in Corey Barr's honor, who left behind his wife and their twin 3-year-old girls in the name of duty. Southwest Pedestrian Bridge. One moment, drivers on Southwest 8th Street in Miami were cruising through traffic like any other afternoon. Cars were packed onto the lane, inching forward on one of the busiest stretches in South Florida. And suddenly, the 174-foot pedestrian bridge above gave way and collapsed directly onto the 8-lane highway below. It happened so fast that drivers had no chance to react. The cars directly underneath were completely buried under 950 tons of concrete and steel. Drivers who weren't crushed rushed out of their vehicles to help the wounded, while emergency services raced to the scene. But despite their efforts, 6 people lost their lives and 10 others were injured. 8 vehicles were still trapped beneath the rubble. The bridge itself was brand new. It had been installed just 5 days earlier and was meant to keep students safe after an 18-year-old lost her life while crossing that same road the year before. What made the collapse even harder to sit with was that just 2 days before that, the lead engineer had left a voicemail with the state's transport department warning about the crack. However, the employee he called didn't hear the message until after the bridge had already fallen. Despite all the red flags, traffic was never stopped. Ultimately, investigations concluded that the collapse was caused by a design error. Thus, 18 civil lawsuits were filed. The main contractor filed for bankruptcy and eventually reached a $42 million settlement with victims and their families. When the dashcam footage was posted online, viewers pointed out that a school bus was just a few cars behind the bridge when it collapsed. If timing had been slightly different, the outcome could have been even worse. Level 4. Driver loses control. A woman was driving across the Arlington Memorial Bridge around 7 p.m. when her dashcam caught something unexpected. A white pickup came up from behind her, noticeably faster than the flow of traffic, and within seconds, it collided with the car ahead. The impact sent it veering sharply into oncoming traffic, and before anyone could react, the truck slammed full speed into the bridge's stone barrier. Those barriers are meant to stop exactly this kind of thing, but they didn't. Instead, the stone gave way, and in a split second, the truck broke straight through and plunged into the icy Potomac River below. Witnesses immediately ran toward the edge, hoping to see where the truck went in, but there was nothing to see, just black water and ice. By the time divers arrived, the river had already swallowed the vehicle whole. They spent 22 minutes searching beneath the frozen surface before they finally found it. When they pulled the driver out and got him to shore, he was barely holding on. And unfortunately, he died at the hospital that same night. However, the tragedy didn't end there. When crews returned to recover the truck, they found a second dead body inside. No one had realized that there was another person in the car that whole time. The victims were identified as twin brothers Jarrell and Jared Wirt from Chesapeake Beach, Maryland. Their sister later said they had been heading to a job in D.C. that evening. Jared had been driving and worked as an HVAC mechanic, and Jarrell was the passenger and worked as a carpenter. Investigators confirmed the crash began with the initial collision on the bridge, which left 2 people in the other car with minor injuries. Harbour Bridge standstill. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is one of Australia's busiest landmarks. So, to manage traffic flow, the bridge uses a tidal system that shifts lanes based on the time of day. More lanes head into the city in the morning and more head out in the afternoon. It's a system designed to keep things moving, but on October 16, 2024, it became the setting for a fatal misunderstanding. A Hyundai sedan was traveling northbound when it suddenly drifted across the center line into oncoming traffic. The car just veered as if the driver had assumed the outside lane was heading in the same direction. It wasn't. The next moment, the Hyundai slammed headfirst into another car. The force of the impact set off a chain reaction that pulled 4 vehicles and a bus into the wreckage within seconds. Metal and glass were scattered across the bridge's lanes, bringing one of Sydney's most critical arteries to a complete standstill. By the time emergency services arrived, one driver had already lost his life. A short time later, a second driver was pronounced dead at the scene. The other drivers involved in the crash were taken to the hospital for assessment. The damage was so severe that firefighters had to use hydraulic tools to cut one of the injured victims out of their vehicle. And while emergency crews were still treating patients at the scene, another disaster nearly unfolded. A motorcyclist tried to weave through the wreckage to get past, but the police were quick enough to stop and arrest him on the spot. Ultimately, no charges were filed over the collision, but for a city with limited options for crossing the harbor, the crash was a reminder of just how fragile that single artery can be. Illegal driving. Drivers on the I-10 freeway west in Ontario, California, were moving at a normal pace on October 21st, 2025. What they didn't know was that a Freightliner semi-truck was barreling up behind them far faster than the speed limit allowed, and it wasn't slowing down. In the next instant, the semi slammed into the back of the line of vehicles with such force that flames burst out on contact. The collision sent it veering to the right, where it tore through even more cars and utility vehicles before finally grinding to a halt near the shoulder. By the time the wreckage settled, 8 vehicles had been destroyed, including 4 commercial trucks. The damage was immediate and catastrophic, as 3 people lost their lives instantly. Others were pulled from the debris with major injuries, including a man who had simply been standing outside his vehicle when the truck tore through. One car was so badly crushed that it took investigators over a day just to identify 2 of the victims inside. As for the driver, he was arrested at the scene and found to be driving under the influence. Authorities later identified him as Jashanpreet Singh, a 21-year-old immigrant from India who had entered the United States illegally through the southern border back in 2022. What made this even worse was that Singh should never have been behind the wheel in the first place. Apparently, despite his immigration status, he held a valid California commercial driver's license that had been updated just 6 days before the crash. Under an emergency federal policy issued weeks earlier, he should not have been eligible to hold that license at all, but somehow the system failed to catch him in time. Singh now faces 3 counts of gross vehicular while intoxicated, along with DUI causing injury. ICE has lodged a detainer against him, and he remains in custody without bail. Don't drink and drive. Don't drink and drive. Don't drink and drive. If you have a friend who's going to drink and drive, stop him. Level 5. UPS plane takeoff. The UPS air cargo plane had done more than 21,000 trips without incident. So when it lined up for takeoff at Louisville's International Airport, there was no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. However, the moment the plane lifted off the runway, something went fatally wrong. Without warning, the left engine tore off the wing and slammed into the aircraft. In a blink, the plane came crashing down in a fireball so massive it looked like something out of a movie. All 3 crew members on board lost their lives instantly. But the destruction didn't stop there. The crash tore through the ground below, taking the lives of 12 more people and injuring 23 others. The aftermath was devastating. Cars were burnt beyond recognition, and nearby businesses and buildings were left in ruins. Later on, investigators recovered the black boxes from the wreckage. The data showed the plane reached only a few hundred feet and just over 200 miles per hour before everything abruptly stopped. What they uncovered next raised even more questions. It turned out that the failure traced back to the structure holding the left engine in place. Over time, cracks had formed, weakening it. Even worse, a mandatory inspection that should have caught the problem thousands of flights earlier had never been completed. 2 days after the crash, the local union held a vigil at 5:14 p.m., the exact minute the plane had gone down. 200 people stood in silence for the crew and the ground workers who never had a chance to say goodbye. I hate how often we hear about plane crashes and the cause ends up being, oh, an inspection or maintenance just wasn't done. 30 seconds flight. On January 31st, 2025, a medical jet operated by Jet Rescue Air Ambulance took off from Northeast Philadelphia Airport just after 6 p.m. It was carrying a young girl who had just finished treatment at a children's hospital in Philadelphia, along with her mother and 4 crew members, and they were headed home to Mexico. But 30 seconds after takeoff, something stopped working. The plane climbed to about 1,500 feet, and without warning, it dropped. Not a gradual descent, it was steep, almost a vertical nosedive straight into the ground. Below, a driver cruising along Cottman Avenue near Roosevelt Mall had their dashcam running. The footage captured a bright streak cutting through the evening sky before exploding massively at the intersection. The impact tore through everything in its path. The jet slammed into cars, struck multiple homes, and sent debris scattering across nearly 6 blocks. 5 houses caught fire almost instantly, and people at nearby restaurants were thrown into chaos. One witness said his house shook so hard he thought the city was under attack. Obviously, none of the 6 people on board survived. One person on the ground also lost their life, and at least 19 others were seriously injured. Investigators spent days combing through the wreckage, searching the cockpit voice recorder or anything else that might explain what went wrong. However, so far it hasn't been stated if they found anything. The crash left behind a massive crater, burned out cars, and scorched homes across an area so large it would take weeks to fully assess. For a family that was finally heading home after treatment, and for a neighborhood that watched a plane fall from the sky, 30 seconds was all it took. Bagram military aircraft. A driver was passing through Bagram airfield in Afghanistan when he noticed something strange in the sky ahead. A massive cargo plane had just taken off and was climbing steadily into the distance, engines roaring as it gained altitude. But in the next moment, the aircraft stalled, and within seconds, it began rolling from side to side as if struggling to stay airborne. The plane rapidly continued to lose control, and before the driver could fully process what was happening, it tipped forward and dropped straight out of the sky. The aircraft slammed nose first into the ground just off the side of the road, and the impact instantly triggered a massive explosion, sending thick black smoke into the sky. The plane turned out to be a Boeing 747-400 with 7 crew members on board. It had been carrying 5 armored military vehicles as part of the U.S. military drawdown from Afghanistan. Each vehicle weighed up to 24 tons, so the cargo hold was packed with over 60 tons of heavy machinery. Later on, investigators discovered that the vehicles hadn't been properly secured, so when the plane tilted upward during takeoff, they broke loose and rolled straight to the back of the hold. They crashed through the rear pressure bulkhead and ended up destroying the tail's flight controls entirely. As a result, the pilots had no way to bring the nose back down. The aircraft was locked in an uncontrollable state, and by the time it stalled, recovery was impossible. By the end, all 7 crew members on board lost their lives instantly. Birthday tragedy. It started as a typical roadside dispute between 2 frustrated drivers, but what followed was anything but typical. The dispute unfolded on Highway 231 in Panama City, Florida. It was between a red GMC Terrain and a gray Dodge Ram pickup. At some point, a woman stepped out of the SUV to confront the pickup's driver, and a brief scuffle followed before both parties returned to their vehicles. But as the SUV pulled away, the pickup pulled up right alongside, and that's when things turned deadly. The passenger in the pickup leaned out of his window, and before anyone in the SUV could react, he raised a gun and squeezed the trigger. 11 shots ripped through the SUV's windows, hitting the driver and a backseat passenger. An officer who had been patrolling a nearby parking lot heard the shots and spotted the gray truck fleeing the scene. He took off after it immediately, while other police vehicles eventually joined the chase. When they finally cornered the pickup in a Holiday Inn parking lot, the driver rammed into patrol cars in a desperate attempt to escape before being detained. As investigators pieced together what had happened, the details only made it harder to process. The woman behind the wheel of the SUV was Georgianne Park Garner. She was a single mother of 2 who had spent that afternoon celebrating her birthday with her daughter, Marilei. They were heading to dinner when the dispute broke out. Georgianne didn't survive, and Marilei was rushed to the ICU with a bullet wound to her chest. As for the shooter, he was identified as 23-year-old Hubal Simons, and his girlfriend, Ibibella Encino, had been the one driving. Neither of them had ever crossed paths with Georgianne or her family before that day. Simons now faces 9 charges, including first-degree murder. He also repeatedly told investigators he didn't care if he spent the rest of his life in prison. A GoFundMe set up by Georgianne's best friend described her as someone whose smile could light up a room. She had just turned 48, and a simple drive to dinner became the last thing she ever did. Level 6. Police chase. A police chase through Billings, Montana on July 5th, 2013 turned deadly when an escaped convict refused to surrender. Earlier that morning, the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office received a tip. Dean Randolph Jess, an inmate who had escaped from Montana State Prison, was believed to be somewhere in town. Deputies spread out across the West End checking likely spots until one patrol unit spotted a green Jeep Rubicon pulling out of a Walmart parking lot. Once the vehicle was identified, the officers surrounded it from multiple angles and cut off any chance of escape. But being trapped didn't make Jess cooperate. He stayed inside the vehicle and refused to come out. Through the windows, deputies could see him holding a handgun close to his chest. Officers formed a perimeter with their weapons drawn, calling him by name and ordering him to drop the gun, but he didn't give in. The standoff dragged on until one deputy shouted a final warning. Seconds later, Jess moved the gun toward one of the officers, and that was when Lieutenant Shane Skillen fired. The dashcam captured deputies rushing forward to break open the door and pull Jess from the vehicle, but it was already too late. His life ended at the scene. Jess had been serving a 55-year sentence for in Park County with a prior conviction in Washington state. He escaped while on a work detail for the prison's motor vehicle maintenance, and his abandoned vehicle was found 1.5 miles from the facility. For 4 days, ground and air searches turned up nothing until that Friday morning when someone walked into the sheriff's office and reported being contacted by him. Investigators traced a call he'd made from a payphone at Walmart, which led deputies to where to look. A coroner's jury later convened to determine whether the shooting was justified. It took them just 5 minutes to reach their verdict. Lieutenant Skillen had acted appropriately. Jess had managed to travel nearly 250 miles after escaping prison. It all ended when he chose not to put the gun down. the BB gun.
Don't do it! Don't do it! Drop it!
Those were the words Sergeant J.M. Dorsey kept repeating as a traffic stop in Johnston County spiraled out of control. It started as a speeding violation. A Nissan Maxima clocked at 96 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone on NC 70. Dorsey pursued the vehicle from Wayne County until the driver finally pulled over near Princeton. But as soon as the sergeant approached the window and began speaking to the driver, something felt off. The man appeared unusually nervous and his eyes kept drifting toward the glove compartment.
What's in there? A gun?
Dorsey asked about it. The driver admitted there was a gun inside. That response changed everything. Dorsey told him to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. However, the driver refused. And the next instant, the man lunged for the glove compartment and pulled out what looked like a handgun. Dorsey reacted immediately. He drew his weapon and shouted for the driver to drop over and over. But again, the driver didn't comply. So Dorsey thought he had no choice but to fire through the back passenger window, striking him 3 times in the back. Backup and EMS were called immediately. When officers arrived, they pulled the driver from the car and administered first aid while he lay on the ground apologizing. "I'm sorry, I did something stupid." The driver was identified as Darius Jaquan Rogers and was rushed to Wake Med in Raleigh. 6 days later, he was released. As for the gun, investigators recovered it from the scene and discovered it wasn't real. It was a .40 XP air pistol, a BB gun designed to look like a Glock with no orange tip to indicate otherwise. Later on, the district attorney Susan Doyle cleared Sergeant Dorsey of any charges. Officers make split-second decisions, she noted, and under those circumstances, his use of force was both reasonable and warranted. Ultimately, Rogers survived, but he came within inches of dying over a toy that looked too real in the wrong moment. A broken brake light. It was one of the most routine stops an officer can make, a broken brake light. Nothing about it suggested it would end any other way. Officer Michael Slager had pulled over a Mercedes-Benz driven by 50-year-old Walter Scott. He asked for his license and registration and walked back to his cruiser to run the check. But as he sat in his vehicle, something changed. Scott opened his car door, stepped out briefly, then got back in. Seconds later, he opened the door again, and this time, he ran. Slager immediately took off after him, and both men disappeared from the frame. What happened next only came to light because a passerby saw an officer chasing a black man toward an empty lot and felt something was wrong, so he pulled out his phone and started recording. His footage showed Slager and Scott standing close together with a brief scuffle between them. Seconds later, Scott broke free and started running away from the officer. He was about 30 feet away when Slager did something unexpected. He drew his gun and fired 8 times into Scott's back. Immediately, Scott slumped to the ground. Slager then walked over, radioed that shots had been fired, and told dispatch that Scott had grabbed his taser. He shouted at the motionless man to put his hands behind his back, then handcuffed him face down in the dirt. When Scott's family was first told what happened, they were informed that police had acted in accordance with procedure, and that likely would have been the end of it. However, what the bystanders' camera also caught was Slager jogging back to where the scuffle had happened, picking something up off the ground, and dropping it next to Scott's body. It was the taser, which means everything Slager said was a lie. Within days after the footage went viral, Slager was fired and arrested. Even his own lawyer resigned. The state murder trial that was held in 2016 ended without a verdict, but federal prosecutors stepped in, and eventually Slager pleaded guilty to civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. Ultimately, in December 2017, a U.S. district judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison, ruling that Slager had shot Scott with malice and recklessness, then lied to investigators about what happened. The traffic stop. A man in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, did everything he was supposed to do during a routine traffic stop in 2016. But none of that mattered to the policeman who stopped him. The officer, Geronimo Yanez, had pulled over a white sedan for a broken rear light. Inside were a man, his girlfriend, and their 4-year-old daughter in the back seat. Yanez asked for license and registration, and Castile began to comply, but he also did something he was legally required to do. He informed the officer that he had a licensed firearm in the vehicle. That was when everything escalated. Yanez immediately told him not to reach for the gun. The driver calmly responded that he wasn't going to, but as he moved, trying to follow instructions, Yanez drew his weapon and fired 7 shots into the car. His girlfriend immediately began recording, and through the window, Yanez could still be seen pointing his gun into the car, shouting. The man, who was later identified as Philando Castile, lost his life shortly after. When the video spread, it sparked protests across the country and reignited a national debate over police use of force against Black Americans. 5 months later, Yanez was charged with second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of dangerous discharge of a firearm. At trial, he testified that he had seen Castile pulling the gun from his pocket despite being told not to, and that he feared for his life. However, the prosecutors pointed out that the gun was still in Castile's pocket when paramedics removed him from the vehicle. Yanez never actually saw the weapon and had overreacted to a man who was simply trying to follow instructions. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury acquitted Yanez of all charges. However, he was still fired from the police force, and the city later settled with Castile's family for $3.8 million. But for those who watched the video, none of that changed the ending. A man followed the law, tried to do everything right, and still didn't make it home. Level 7. The Ukraine commute. It was rush hour on October 10th, 2022, when a dashcam caught the moment an ordinary drive turned into something far more terrifying. Cars were moving through a residential area as usual. Then, without warning, a missile dropped out of the sky and slammed into the road ahead. Cars immediately started turning backwards as they tried to make sense of what was happening. And just when people thought it was over, a second explosion erupted, this one far larger than the first. The blast was so massive that it tore through the residential area and engulfed everything within its radius. That morning, at least 5 missiles struck the city of Dnipro. Air defense systems intercepted most of them, but 2 reached their targets. 3 people lost their lives instantly. 16 others sought medical care, most with minor shrapnel wounds, though 6 had to be hospitalized. The blast damaged a water main, blew out windows and doors in nearby residential buildings, and left a dormitory so badly wrecked that residents had to be evacuated to temporary housing the following morning. 2 cars were completely burned and 10 more were damaged. There was no major statement that followed. In the middle of an ongoing war, this strike became just another entry in a growing record of attacks. Texas Mall Incident. It was a Saturday afternoon, just after 3:30 p.m. at the Allen Premium Outlets in Texas. The parking lot was full. Families were walking in and out of stores on what should have been an ordinary weekend. A silver sedan pulled into the lot and stopped near the entrance, and a man stepped out dressed in all black, carrying what appeared to be an AR-15 style rifle. Before anyone noticed what was happening, he raised it and started firing. The sound echoed across the parking lot as shoppers tried to process what was happening. Some ran toward the mall entrance, others dove behind cars, and within seconds, people were already on the ground. Inside the mall, the gunfire was loud enough to cut through walls and storefronts. About a dozen people barricaded themselves in a bathroom closet, listening to the chaos outside, certain they would be next. Meanwhile, the gunman kept moving, firing at anyone in his path across the parking lot and exterior walkways. But what he didn't know was that a police officer happened to be at the mall on an unrelated call. The officer heard the gunfire, ran toward it, and engaged the shooter alone. By 3:36 p.m., roughly 6 minutes after the first shot, the gunman was down. However, those 6 minutes were enough for 8 people to lose their lives. 7 others were wounded, with at least 3 in critical condition the following day. The shooter was later identified as 33-year-old Mauricio Garcia. When officers searched his car, still parked at the scene, they found more handguns, additional long guns, and extra ammunition. And then came the detail that made everything worse. Investigators believe Garcia had scouted the mall multiple times over the past year. He had even screenshotted the mall's peak hours, Saturday 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. This was the 198th in America that year, and it was only May. The Nova Music Festival. On the morning of October 7th, 2023, thousands of young people were dancing in the Nova Music Festival near the Israeli border with Gaza. They had no idea of the horror that was about to unfold. The first sign that something was wrong came around 7 a.m. In one video, a man can be seen looking up at the sky, distracted by something in the distance. Within minutes, security staff were rushing through the crowd, urging everyone to leave as quickly as possible. But by then, it was already too late. Hamas fighters had crossed the border and were closing in on the festival grounds. The confusion turned into panic as loud cracks echoed across the site. People scattered into open fields, hiding whatever they could, while the gunmen moved through the area, shooting at anyone in sight. Dashcam footage from a car parked at the edge of the festival showed the gunmen shooting non-stop at the partygoers. By the time it was over, at least 260 bodies were discovered at the festival site alone. Across Israel, the death toll climbed past 1,100, with more than 200 people taken hostage. The attack triggered an immediate and massive military response. Airstrikes began within hours, borders were sealed, and supplies into Gaza were cut. Israel's prime minister warned the country was entering a long and difficult war, one that is still ongoing as of today. These disasters unfolded in real time, but if you want to see what the exact moment before everything goes wrong looks like, watch The Most Disturbing Videos Before Disasters, Volume 5.